Thank you so much for joining us today. I am Susan Demas, the executive editor here at Lincoln Square. And joining me is a fellow Michigander, Mari Manoogian. She's a former state representative here in Michigan from the Metro Detroit area. And she has since worked for Kamala Harris's campaign as the Midwest political director. And now she is the new executive director of the Next 50, a group that is dedicated to finding the next generation of Democratic leadership, which is a project I think many of us can endorse. So thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited.
Yeah, well, why don't you tell us a little bit about this group and how
Yeah,
it formed and, what you're planning to do now?
sure. The Next 50 is a relatively new organization. It cropped up right around the time of the 2020 presidential election. And honestly, it was our co founder, Zach Malamed, and some of the folks that he knew. He was living out in San Francisco at the time. And really, it was just an opportunity that he saw to get next generation voters in front of the slew of presidential candidates. And so they hosted events at Manny's in San Francisco, and many of the presidential candidates in the 2020 cycle came through and were introduced to young voters, young donors, folks who were sort of looking to break into the political donor space, but really had never, been in politics before. They were mostly in tech. And so that's sort of how the organization began. It has now since become something much more different than what it originally was. And today, we are now in our fourth cycle of endorsements. We had a pilot cycle in 2020. We participated in 2022, 2024, and now we're in the 2026 cycle, where we endorse and support 50 next generation leaders who are looking to bring the Democratic Party out of the wilderness. We basically see ourselves as talent scouts for the next generation of leaders in the Democratic Party. And we provide both political support, but we also know that, and I know this from being a candidate myself, that you can't do the work without the resources. And so, one of the things that we really focus on is making sure that our next generation leaders have the financial resources to be able to run their campaigns. And so, our endorsement doesn't just come with like a pat on the back, it comes with financial support and bundling as well.
And what levels of government do you endorse for? Is it just for Congress? Is it for state house level?
Sure. So we do about 20 to 25% federal work, and the rest of it is state and local. Obviously, as a former state representative from a battleground state and a battleground district myself, I'm, of course, very excited to engage in state legislature work, but also really eager, especially this cycle, to focus on electing mayors. We know that mayors tend to be some of the most trusted folks who run as Democrats and some of the most trusted elected officials, regardless of party affiliation, because they're the people who really dig in and do the day in and day out work of making sure our society functions. And so, for us, we see a real opportunity in bolstering the Democratic brand with folks who can bring us out of the wilderness by engaging in some of those more local races.
And I know, a kind of a big criticism of the Democratic Party has been that there is not a lot of emphasis on building the bench, down to the state level, down to the local level. It's kind of like every 4 years with the presidential election, there's the big push to get young voters involved, and then that kind of falls away. And I know that a lot of donors on the Republican side, have been focused on, spreading money around at every level. So, given those challenges, and especially after the last election, when, of course, Democrats lost at the presidential level, and also lost the Senate, how hard is it to get people behind this cause, and to raise the money for it, frankly?
I mean, to be honest with you, people, it's very clear whether you're looking at voters and you're seeing this, bear out in some of the primaries that have happened over the course of the last month and a half or so, to donors. People are looking for a breath of fresh air right now,
Mhm.
especially folks who tend to be donors and voters on the Democratic side. We're really looking, and I kind of sort of harkens back to when I first ran for office in 2017 and 2018. People are looking for a breath of fresh air and a next generation leader. again, to sort of lead our party out of the wilderness and chart a new course for us. And so I would say, of course, raising money in politics is always hard. I'm not going to say that it's, ever an easy task. Our candidates, just like anyone else, have to spend a lot of time talking to donors, talking, on the phone for call time, unfortunately. But what I will say is that having a message of us sort of, being those talent scouts that can, call upon our relationships across the states and across the battlegrounds to really dig in and see who are the people that we maybe don't know about yet, but are phenomenal communicators in these battleground districts in Arizona and Pennsylvania and in Michigan, who we can help support. And there are donors who are very excited. Of course, we will welcome many more to our cause. But the conversations that we've had thus far this cycle, donors are very excited to support next generation leaders for sure.
Can you talk to us a little bit about some of the folks that you've endorsed, maybe from a couple different parts of the country and kind of what their message is and how their campaigns are going?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first of all, I'd like to set the stage by saying we're very excited to be 2-0 so far with our endorsements. We've made 12 this cycle, and one is already sworn into office. We supported Gina Ortiz Jones for mayor of San Antonio. This was a really important election. I want to set the stage for this as well. Most people would consider mayoral elections to not be a battleground, but in fact, this is Texas. It's Greg Abbott's Texas. And Greg Abbott and his, billionaire donors made significant contributions to Gina's opponent during the runoff. She was outspent considerably, but still won her mayoralship, and so she was sworn in about a month ago. That was one that we were really excited about. We believe that it is important for us to be, supporting strong candidates who are in the emerging battleground of Texas and helping to build that bench there. So that's someone who we are really thrilled we were able to be helpful for. In Virginia, we're excited. We've got 5 endorsements. Abigail Spanberger has been a Next 50 candidate for a couple of cycles, so we are excited to keep her in the Next 50 family. That's one of the things about our organization that's a little different than others is that we like to stick with our leaders as they ascend
Mm.
through leadership. It's really important to us that we build a strong relationship with them and their team, that they can trust that we're going to have their back. And that's sort of all part of doing the bench building work, is not just,
Mm.
making that one-off endorsement for one cycle and then sort of sending them out into the world, but making sure that they know that we've got their back and we're able to help them, not just with another contribution, but also making sure that they are able to tap into a new network of donors when they move on to the next race.
And
So, of
so,
course, we have Sandberger.
okay, right.
Yeah.
And she was elected to Congress first in
Yeah.
2018, right? And
Yes.
now she is running for governor.
That's
And
right.
okay, great.
Yep. And then we have a few House of Delegates races that we're excited about as well. We have a reelection in the Virginia Beach, Hampton Roads area in Delegate Michael Feggins. It was one of the closest races in the Commonwealth last cycle for the legislature. So we're really excited to get behind Michael again. He's a phenomenal candidate. And then we have 2 challenger candidates, Kimberly Pope Adams and Lily Franklin. One is running in a more rural area, the other in a more suburban area, but both of those candidates are phenomenal. They lost by, I think collectively, they might have lost by like less than 1,000 votes combined last cycle. And so we're excited to support them too.
Great. Well, I know that since the 2024 election, obviously there's been a lot of reflection, hand wringing, self flagellation. That's kind of the way the
That's what we
Democratic.
do.
Right, right. Even when Democrats win, but
Yes.
especially when Democrats lose. And so, there are a lot of different thoughts about the way that, Democrats move forward right now. And I know that, there are big ideological divides. There's obviously progressives like Bernie Sanders in AOC. There are people who are more the middle of the road, like Alyssa Slotkin, who is the new U.S. Senator here in Michigan. But one thing that I've seen kind of define people who seem to be resonating with folks is just the willingness to fight back against Trump, to fight for their vision of what America is, whether that is something that would be considered to be more moderate or more progressive. And so I'm just kind of wondering what you're seeing, and in terms of the candidates that your organization endorses, Is it more about a willingness to stand up for things, or how important is ideology?
The thing that we look for, and I keep using the term bringing us out of the wilderness, but we really do focus our resources on battleground states and battleground districts. Those, of course, can be pretty loosely defined. I just talked about Texas as an emerging battleground. But the common thread amongst all of our candidates, whether they're running in a place like Texas or in Michigan, or our amazing candidates who ran for the legislature in Alaska, and help make sure that there was a coalition government that was able to flip the state legislature in Alaska. The things that are common among all of our candidates is that they imbue the values of their district.
Mm,
They understand their community, they understand their voters, and they're able to speak to the issues that matter most to them. So I think you're absolutely right in thinking about this frame as a fight or no fight sort of way of looking at things this cycle. To be honest with you, I think if you ask the average voter who's like not as plugged in, they're not a Substack viewer, they're just somebody who, thankfully they do cast their vote. And they are engaged in our democracy in that way. I think they're just looking for someone who can speak to the issues that are top of mind to them. And that to me is really the thing that is going to, it sounds so simple, but people can get so lost in the polling and the message testing and how do I triangulate myself to meet the moderate needs of my district. I think the reality here is that we're in a time when people are on information overload, and if they can hear someone in their community who is a voice that they trust or that they feel that they can trust, is listening to them and can has their best interests at heart and is speaking to the issues that matter most to them. Frankly, right now, it's cost of living. I think that that's a pretty obvious one, whether that's the cost of groceries, housing costs. I recently just saw a clip that was like sort of a mashup of a bunch of mayors from across the entire country, regardless of party affiliation, that said the cost of living, and specifically the cost of housing, is the biggest
mm.
crisis that their cities are facing. I think that that's exactly what folks are looking for this cycle.
Yeah, and it seems like these days people really want authenticity, and you can
Yes.
tell, when someone is full of it and when they actually get it. And to me, that seems like it's more important to a lot of people than, even the fine details of their policy. And so, if people if people sound like, they have no idea how much the price of eggs are these days, who wants to listen to them? And is that something that you're finding with the candidates that you're working with?
Definitely. And I think, I do want to zoom out and say, I think that one of the big reasons that the president is the president yet again is that, voters perceived him to be somebody who's authentic, even though we know he's incredibly untruthful, and, is deceitful in the way that he communicates with his voters, and just says whatever he thinks it will take, to get people to be on his side and to get him elected. But, the reality is that voters sort of saw him as a no BS kind of guy. And that is, one of the strengths that he consistently has when he's communicating, is that he is, just sort of willing to say whatever is top of mind. That's not necessarily what I'm looking for in a president, but I do have to say, I do have to say, without thinking about it first, or maybe thinking twice about saying something, but I think the reality is that candidates are our candidates, the way that we're looking at the map and the way that we're looking at who we think are really some of the strongest leaders across the country that can represent our party and our values, is that they are able to speak authentically. And it's not just speaking authentically, it's meeting voters where they are. So whether that's being someone who understands how to communicate well on Instagram or on TikTok, or someone who can, really, go out into the community and maybe have community events in places like Ruben Gallego did last cycle, where he was out and he was at a boxing watch party, different things
And
that are.
he was running for Senate in Arizona and won.
That's right. And so, that's sort of a great example. He's an X50 leader as well. He was one of the couple of candidates that we endorsed last cycle for the US Senate. And, one of those, just sort of using him as the example, he went out into the community and talked to people who maybe wouldn't otherwise engage with him, in a political setting. And so I think that's another piece of the authenticity conversation, is it's not just what you're saying, but it's where you're saying it.
Yeah, absolutely. What is kind of your takeaway of, the big story over the last couple weeks with Zoran Mandami winning the Democratic mayoral primary? He's young, he's energetic, He calls himself a democratic socialist, and he beat the former governor of New York.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things going on here. What I'm about to say is not to discredit Zoran's immense political capabilities. I want to touch on that as well, but in nominating or even considering nominating Andrew Cuomo for that for the mayoral seat in New York. I would say centrists and moderates really put themselves at a disadvantage here. They chose a candidate who was deeply flawed, who ran a campaign of grievance. And while that may work for the Republicans, it doesn't work for us.
Mm.
That's not what our voters are looking for. And I hope that that is, a lesson that we can all sort of take away from this conversation is that that's really not the direction that our primary voters are looking to head in. They're looking for a breath of fresh air, as I said earlier in our conversation. But I do want to say that I think that Zoran Mamdami's ability to connect with voters, his instincts are very good. This isn't to say that there's not, room for improvement. I think that there's, plenty of room for improvement when it comes to being very clear about his position on tackling anti-Semitism and other really important conversations that are now worthy of having during the general election. But I think there is no denying the fact that he is a very strong communicator. He understands the needs of voters. And I really think that he had tapped into, a really important moment for us where we were sort of down as a party. And this was an opportunity for someone to come in and be a breath of fresh air. And I think that's what you saw in that mayoral primary.
And he talked about affordability all the time,
Yeah.
the lack of affordable housing. And, those are big issues, especially in blue states and blue cities. There's been a problem with building enough housing. And very interestingly, Governor of California, Gavin Newsom, just signed a law that will make it a lot easier to build in one of the most expensive, places to live in the country. And so, you are kind of seeing people from across the political spectrum for Democrats who, are getting this and, doing their messaging and their policies might be different, but, it does seem like affordability with a recession probably on the horizon is really the number one issue out there, whether you're in Michigan or California or Texas or wherever.
That's exactly right. I think, one of the things you had mentioned about, what we're looking for our candidates, regardless of what state or district they're in. I think, again, it's their ability to understand what those issues are and also understanding that, especially at the state level, it's not always a one size fits all when it comes to what kinds of policies will work best for those districts or those states. And so I think that there's two different things happening here. One is being able to speak to the issues that matter most to voters, and the other is coming up with the right solution or the right policy fix for that challenge. And I think, we do live in a society right now that is definitely tied to instant gratification, and that can make things incredibly challenging when, you need time to implement a particular piece of policy or time to implement more affordable housing. But the reality is if you continue to have those conversations with voters and sort of set those expectations that, this is going to take time, but you're building that trust along the way. I think that this is something that, all of our candidates, especially at the next 50, are able to really touch upon.
I wanted to talk to you a little bit about, how media narratives get made and how influential they still are. I know we obviously have so many different forms of social media, and it's a very effective way to reach younger voters. But the mainstream media, whether it's cable news or the New York Times, they do still set a lot of the agenda. It's still kind of the articles and the coverage that people are talking about on TikTok. And, I know that younger candidates who are just emerging, if there are like negative stories about them, that can be very harmful. So I'm kind of curious what your take is. I mean, obviously, you ran for office, you were younger. I know you faced some blowback, and that's definitely, I would think, a challenge for people who want to be in public service, but this is a negative part of running.
It can be a challenge for sure. But what I think the way that I think about things, and I think the way that most of our younger candidates are thinking about things, is that being able to be really digitally literate and understanding that these are tools in the toolbox for being able to get your message across and defining yourself before the opposition gets the opportunity to define you is really the way forward here for our party. And being able to sort of build what I would sort of call like a parasocial relationship with your voters. So voters really feel like they know you, they feel that they can trust you, and that they've gotten to know you well enough that they may not agree with you on every single issue, but they trust that you have their best interests at heart. And I think that's one huge advantage that younger candidates, and particularly campaigns that have really digitally literate staff, having now been on both sides of the equation, having worked on the presidential campaign and sort of served as an advisor for campaigns as well, being able to have both a candidate that understands the usefulness and the importance of communicating with their voters via different digital platforms, whether it is going live on Substack or even sending a Substack note out to their voters. I know Jared Golden, a Next 50 candidate from last cycle, is someone who has a really great Substack. It's a way that he communicates with Mainers. And that's something that is a sort of newer piece of communication that most members of Congress don't use. But he's able to build a lot of credibility through it. And I think that, that's one of the ways that you're able to, as a young candidate, sort of either get coverage and attention for yourself because you're not the establishment, and typically media narratives can be more favorable to establishment figures, but at the same time it's a way for you to sort of drive coverage of what you're doing, and able to set that narrative for yourself.
Do you see that it's more challenging for female candidates and candidates of color, facing some of these media narratives and navigating everything? Because, there is still kind of an old boys club mentality in the press.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's always extra hurdles when you're someone who is seeking to enter the halls of power when you may not have anyone else there or few people there that look like you, or come from your same background. And what I would say on all of that is, I think I think back on my time in the legislature, I did like a lot of education about what it means to be a young person in Michigan. I did a lot of education. For example, I was the only Armenian American that served in the legislature. And like, we're not a really big diaspora community in Michigan, but we are, 1 million people strong across the United States. And we are really politically engaged. So I did a lot of, educating folks about what that meant. And I think, as much as it kind of sucks to have that as a burden as a candidate, I think it is really, I think as we're seeing more women run for office, more people of color run for office, particularly in our battleground districts, we've seen a lot of women step up to the plate in battleground districts. And so those are places that, because it is, more conflict, because it's a much closer race, it'll get covered more frequently. We're seeing these narratives shift. I've been really heartened and excited to see how frequently the conversation around running young candidates has come up, both in national and local press lately.
Well, I had the pleasure of actually covering you when you were in the legislature and, covering Michigan politics for many years. And, I have to say that I've seen a difference in the press corps and how they cover younger candidates, especially younger female candidates. I know that was something you and I have talked about a little bit about the challenge of that is, you're trying to talk about the legislation that you're introducing, and maybe the press wants to talk about things that aren't germane at all. Um, and I hope that that's changing, but, maybe the answer is, more of messaging on social media, independent media on Substack, and with journalists who aren't so beholden to corporate interests and those, agendas. I'm wondering, what you found in talking with candidates. Are they finding that they're able to have better conversations, like on independent media, like Midas Touch or here on Lincoln Square or elsewhere?
For sure. I think One of the things that we've always encouraged our candidates to do is to try to go everywhere. We know that there are different audiences, whether it's here on Lincoln Square or Midas Touch or in their local press or nationally in traditional media or TV versus print. I mean, you name it, there's all different sort of, slices and dices of ways to, look at our media landscape. But what I would say is that we encourage our candidates to go everywhere and to have that conversation with everyone. Are some outlets going to be more challenging to get the kind of coverage that a campaign is looking for their candidate? Absolutely. But with more and more reps, more opportunities for candidates to go and have those conversations, the more comfortable our candidates, especially if they're young candidates and it's their first time running for office, the more opportunity that they have those conversations, the more likely it is that the coverage that they're looking to get will happen. I think, one of the most important things that you can do as a candidate is sort of continue to steer that conversation back to the issues that matter most to your voters. Voters don't care about the sort of side stories and the superfluous information sometimes, and sometimes there is a conversation that is more geared toward conflict than there is towards just really simply talking about the issues that matter most. But at the end of the day, if you're able to stay focused, which is one of the big things we look for in our leaders, we talk about our leaders being principled, pragmatic, energetic, and focused. If you're able to stay focused on what matters most to you and matters most to your constituents, we sort of see over time that media narrative and that conversation will end up being exactly what we're looking for with our candidates.
So I know that it's been a really challenging time. The president signed his budget bill over July 4th weekend, and I know there's a lot of demoralization right now amongst the party and just people in general who don't like the bill, whether they voted for Trump or not. And a lot of people are kind of concerned about we now have a very militarized police force and are we going to be able to exercise certain rights that we have always taken for granted? So how how are candidates that you work with, how are they dealing with this period? Because, it's easy when things are going well and you've got the momentum. A few weeks ago, there were the No Kings protests. And I think that was a real high point. But practically speaking, when Republicans control all the levers of power, there are going to be bad setbacks like this. And so how do you pick yourself up? How do you message? How do you inspire people at these times?
I mean, it is a very, very difficult time. There's no doubt about it. But what I've seen from all of our endorsed candidates, including our alumni who ran last cycle, who are now in office, that are communicating about this legislation, we are in a time where we have to educate people about what has happened here. And we are now it feels so similar to me as to when there were votes to repeal the Affordable Care Act in 2018. We are sort of in that, we're in the off year. I think it happened, those votes were taking place in the summer of 2017. And then more and more candidates started stepping up to the plate to run for office. And really, if you look back on all of the advertising and a lot of the conversation that was happening in 2018, yes, it is very important for us to talk about the threats to our democracy, the threats to our freedom, whether it's through these ICE raids with, masked members of law enforcement. All of that is very important to talk about. And not saying not to have that conversation, but being able to really drill down and say that this president, in spite of however many times he promised he wasn't going to touch these untouchable programs, has now kicked
Like
people off their health
Medicaid,
insurance.
Medicare. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. He's doing this all to line the pockets of the richest people in this country. And this isn't to say that we are not a capitalist society or that we shouldn't, strive for success. But the reality is that this bill does nothing to help the lives of people who need our help the most in our communities. And so the more that we can have that conversation, the more we can drill down to talking about the cost of healthcare, the cost of living, and the fact that this president lied to you. This president lied throughout the campaign, and certainly now that he's been in office, about whether or not he was going to help lower costs. This is only going to increase costs for most Americans. So yes, it can be really hard to get everybody on board, and it is very demoralizing. But we do really need to talk about what's in this bill because the legislation happened so quickly, and there was so much going on that it is very important that we drill down and talk about what was in the bill.
Well, Mari, I really appreciate you being here. What is the best way for people to learn more about the next 50, whether they want to run for office or they just want to know more about candidates who are running in their area?
Awesome. Yeah, please check out our website, thenext50.us. You can take a look at all of the candidates we've supported in the past, as well as the ones we're supporting this cycle. If you're so inclined, you can make a small contribution to us. We have a donate button on our website. And also just reach out to us, info at thenext50.us. Shoot us a note if you've got someone you think that we should have on our radar. We quite literally have a spreadsheet that we call the radar, where we keep, the names of candidates who are running for office top of mind for us, and we check in on their campaigns. We do only make 50 endorsements per cycle. So you can know that we have a judicious eye, and we do 50 because we like to go deep with our candidates and have those really strong relationships. So when you see the endorsement from the next 50, you know that we've done our due diligence, that we're really excited to support them. And you can count on us for scouting the best talent in the Democratic Party.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I appreciate
Thank
you
you for
being here.
having me. This was so great. Great to see
Yeah.
you.
Great to catch up with you.
Yes, take care.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.